Thank you so much for having us. I'm really excited to be here, but also to be chatting with Emily. I think one of the great things about virtual events is that Emily can be in Louisville and I can be here in Nashville, but I could also be in Baltimore and we can still have a great conversation. So yay for that.
And thank you. This is just going to be wonderful. This is a terrific book, and there are so many great synergies between our books, which were published not that far apart in time. And it's been great to just meet Kristina through the intellectual and musical connection.
Yeah. Excellent. How are we going to get started? Was I going to read something first?
I think you're going to start with a little reading from the prologue, because I think it'll give a flavor for those folks tuning in just about how you came to the story and what you started to do to dig into the question of where does this instrument come from? What does it mean?
Yeah. So, centered between two small houses, somewhere in swampy lowlands next to a creek, three people begin to dance. A woman in a green dress bends over slightly. She lifts her heels, stirring the sandy ground beneath her feet. Suspended between her hands, she holds a white and blue striped cloth, pinched by her index fingers and thumbs. Next to her, another woman dances, a cloth outstretched between her hands. They dance on their toes. They look like they're floating. The women face a man. He's bent over too, with a dark wooden dowel in his hands. He raises and lowers the staff as he moves his feet, his blue jacket rising as he lifts his arms, his bare feet and red pants gliding across the makeshift stage. Two instruments drive the music of this dance. To the left of the dancers sits a man with a drum pressed between his knees. To his right, a man in a hat sits with the round body of a stringed instrument squarely in his lap. The tan, dried gourd amplifies the sounds that burst from the strings. To our modern eyes, this may not look like a banjo. It has no circular wooden body, no metal parts. Instead, a flat piece of wood bisects the round gourd, forming the neck and sound chamber. A piece of animal skin sits taut across a circular hole cut into the side of the gourd. Around this white circle, the maker has cut intersecting lines. Strings extend from the bottom of the gourd across the soundboard over a bridge that holds them up and along the board-like neck to where it comes to a triangular point. The short string, flat fingerboard, skin soundboard, and tuning pegs are some of the banjo's defining characteristics. When the white slave owner John Rose saw the scene of enslaved Black people dancing before 1790, he felt it was interesting enough to commit to paper. And there's care in this work, in his brushstrokes and with the people's movements. Look at it and you feel almost instinctively that something significant is happening. In the years since it was first displayed, in the 1930s, the image has gained the title The Old Plantation and has been reprinted in books, on museum walls, and on CD and record covers. This rare piece of art is one of the most significant images of early African-American music and dance in North America, and one of the earliest images of the banjo. Most scholars and historians have assumed that what Rose painted was a social dance or secular celebration. Some have suggested that two of the dancers are jumping the broom, a marriage ceremony among enslaved Blacks in the United States. This reading seems wrong. The painting has no broom. Moreover, the broom ceremony was not a tradition in Africa, hasn't been documented during the period of the painting, and is a folk custom likely introduced to the Americas by Europeans. Other scholars have simply accepted that the painting depicted a dance, and an African dance, even though searches for an analogous dance in Africa have yielded no results. In 2017, my partner Pete Ross and I wandered through the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which explores 800 years of Dutch history through the visual and decorative arts. Pete and I play a sort of game in art museums, a kind of treasure hunt that we had always lost. A trained artist and luthier, Pete has spent decades staring at images of early banjos, researching early banjo accounts, and making gourd banjo recreations and reproductions for museums and musicians. Each time we visit a museum, we joke, "Today we're going to find an image of a banjo that no one has ever noticed before." The idea of finding a lost banjo image always feels both ludicrous and hopeful. On the one hand, how would we discover something new in a painting that has been hanging on a museum wall and been seen by thousands of people every day? Surely we would have known of it already, or we could find it on the internet with a simple search. On the other hand, we know that the banjo's early history, its African-American history, has been willfully hidden and distorted. And in the prologue, I write, only 3 gourd-bodied African-American made banjos exist today. But since I wrote that sentence, a 4th one has appeared. So now there are 4 early gourd-bodied African-American made banjos. It wasn't until the 1970s that the white librarian Dina Epstein published a book outlining pre-Civil War sources that mentioned Black banjo playing. And she admitted that even after looking through hundreds of pages of documents, she still hadn't mined every source. Known images of the banjo before 1820 number less than 15. This all makes it feel like we could find a treasure in our game. We chose the room of Dutch colonial art because 2 of these 3 earliest banjos are from the South American nation of Suriname, formerly Dutch Guiana. We thought the art would expand the landscape of Suriname for us and might help us understand those banjos better. Entering the room, we saw a wall of dioramas, each about as wide as a dining room table. As I moved from one intricate papier-mâché scene of Suriname in the early 1800s to the next, I felt like I had been transported. Then I saw it. There he is, I said, astonished. He's no bigger than my thumb, a Black man leaning against a tree. He wears white pants, a blue shirt, and a headdress of feathers. He tucks an instrument into his right shoulder. It can't be bigger than my fingernail, but there it is, a gourd banjo. I read the information card, Batacan from Paramaribo 1820 by Garrett Schouten. I coaxed Pete over. He looked less excited than I thought he should. His disposition is calmer than mine, but he also wasn't convinced that the instrument was interesting. Feeling that this was another inexact or caricatured version of the banjo, he moved on. I started snapping photos with my phone anyway, trying to get the largest version of the man I could. Pete wandered over to the next diorama. I don't remember his exact words, but holy shit is a favorite expletive. That's it, that's the old plantation, he said. Here was something almost identical to the John Rose watercolor. And what really struck him about it were the women dancing with the scarves, the man in red, and even these kind of jugs that are at the feet of the musicians. We see those jugs and the glass bottle in the same position. And the fact that there was no banjo in the diorama didn't matter to Pete, nor did it matter that the scene was in South America rather than South Carolina. I snapped a few more photos, and in the gift shop, I bought a book on Schouten and the dioramas. We didn't open it until we got home to Baltimore. When I dived into it, the next holy shit moment occurred. The book led me to sources and information about the cultural context of the banjo that had been forgotten. The book, in Dutch, categorized Schouten's dioramas by theme. This one was one that in the book was called Slave Dance. And it included images and details from 6 dioramas made by Schouten between 1817 and 1831. And as Pete and I scanned the pages, a word kept jumping out to him, banya. Without knowing the word, he saw that it was the homophone of banya, which was the name for one of the earliest known banjos, one of those 4 that still exist. What does this say? He asked desperately. What does this word banya mean? At the time, I didn't read Dutch at all, but with knowledge of English, Swedish, and German, I slowly read the passage out loud, trying to locate other homophones and words I might recognize. It's the name of the dance, I said finally. Our jaws both dropped. To date, no one had conclusively discovered the etymological origin of the word banjo. After seeing Schouten's dioramas and understanding that this was the Banya dance, a dance that was very similar to the most iconic piece of art showing an early banjo, and that Banya dance and Banya instrument were homophones, I thought that they had to have connections to each other, despite the distance between Suriname and South Carolina. I knew that no one had connected Schouten's dioramas to Rose's watercolor, and that perhaps by learning more about the Banya Prey, I could learn something about the dance in the South Carolina watercolor, which in turn might tell me something about the music and instruments that accompanied the dance, including the banjo. Like the fictional Alice, I had a moment of idle time, and when I saw something curious and out of place, I jumped down the rabbit hole without thinking how I would get out. But that's okay, because research holes can be wonderlands. The rabbit hole I went down made me realize that, like a creolized language or foodway, the banjo can help us explore the way in which African cultures transformed in the Americas and transformed the Americas. I compulsively researched early accounts of the banjo, which are scarce because those playing the instrument didn't have the opportunity to record their own history, and white people in proximity to the instrument often didn't care to document banjos. I read and reread every available source for descriptions that might be valuable and rediscovered lost sources, ones historians, researchers, and librarians had used in pursuit of other topics, but not to analyze early American music. Along the way, I became frustrated that white supremacy had distorted this history and that better sources don't exist. I used these sources to understand the context in which the banjo is played and tried to interrogate the bias of writers and observers by learning more about them and the world they lived in. I also looked at my own bias as a Swedish American white woman, trying to understand a culture that isn't my own, but is integral to American culture. Our biases have limited the banjo to being a secular instrument. It's in the hands of a lone white man on a porch, a backup instrument in a bluegrass band, or a driver of melodies for a square dance or clogging routine. And the assumption is that the banjo must have always been a secular instrument. But this is putting a Eurocentric worldview on an instrument born of African beliefs and traditions. From my research, I realized that the banjo once served a higher purpose. The instrument was sacred, not just a musical instrument, but a spiritual device, and fit into a cultural complex of music, dance, and spirituality. And in this book, I hope to reveal that cultural complex and to have the banjo take us on a journey to remember the hidden, the willfully ignored, the forgotten, and the lost.
Thank you. That is a great introduction. I can just tell others who are watching that there is so much more, but that does get at the sweep of the sort of new ground that you are covering, Kristina, in this book. And I think also just the meaning of this title, right? You jumped down a rabbit hole, which all self-respecting researchers are waiting to do. But you also jump into a well, right? And the deeper, very deep, so deep we probably can't plumb, but you get a sense of that depth. And I just want to say there is so much that is hidden and so much that is revealed, and the balance in your book between the discoveries and the awareness that we still want to know so much more, right? I don't know how that feels at this point. Now you've written a complete book. Do you still have that feeling of how much more you would like to know?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots, and I have kind of a line at the very end of the book, which is, basically, if you, dear reader, have something that you think you could contribute some knowledge to impart about this, something that excited you about this book, to, kind of dive into it and explore more of it, because even though that section that I read was, kind of this first person exploration of what I'm doing and why, the majority of the book are these historical vignettes of places and times and significant accounts of the banjo and how it relates to music and dance and spirituality, religion. And, within each of those, I tried as best I could to, put us in that place and time as the reader and really experience it. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that, each one of those places and the many places that, the many accounts that didn't actually make it to the book that couldn't fit in, that each of those deserves, its own kind of exploration and unearthing, in the way that I've done here, to try to figure out, more specifics about, each country that it appears in or each person who explores it. So, my hope for this has always been that it's like the beginning and the jumping off point for more people to be interested in not only the banjo, but African-American music, early African-American music, and how that, not only how it coalesced and formed, but how it then dispersed into kind of what we think of as American popular culture.
Right. And it is such an iconic instrument, right? So speaking of instruments, I was hoping that you would do a little show and tell, because not all of us know how the banjo evolved or what it looks or sounds like, besides the way we're, present day iteration is imprinted on us. So you are, your partner is someone who creates banjos. You have something, right?
Yeah, so I have a gourd banjo that Pete built with me here. The things that I like to point out about it is, as I say, that, you know, there's only 4 that are from this early period, you know, kind of before the explosion of blackface minstrelsy, where it becomes a commercial instrument. And none of those 4 are in the United States. They're all in European collections. None of them are in playable condition, and cannot be put into playable condition because they are so fragile and because there are so few of them. You know, if you were to try to put them into playable condition and to damage them, that would be very, very bad. So this is one that Pete made. He modified it a little bit to be more playable, because the original intention for this one was to be played as a prop in the Barry Jenkins production of Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad TV show. It didn't end up actually getting played, but it does make it on screen briefly as a prop. And so they wanted a banjo that might look like it came from South Carolina in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so using some of those, using that historical image from South Carolina, the John Rose watercolor, as well as some of the instruments that exist, Pete built this for them. You can see that it has those cross-shaped sound holes. It has the skin soundboard, the head that is tacked on. It has 4 strings, 3 long and 1 short, but it has tuning pegs like a violin or guitar, but it has a flat fingerboard like guitars do today, like banjos have today, but it doesn't have any fret markers that tell you, you know, where to put your fingers. And it has a little bit of a, you know, it's tuned lower. It has a little bit of a mellower sound than the banjos that we're used to today, simply because of, you know, the gourd body creates kind of a warm resonance and less metal to kind of vibrate around. And I'm going to play just a song on it so we can hear what it sounds like. And this is going to be one that is called Pompey Ran Away. And one of the things I, you know, talk about throughout the book is the kind of intersection between music, dance, spirituality, including the banjo, and the resistance that was inherent in slavery, that people were resisting enslavement by running away, is the kind of common one that we think of, but also, you know, more subtle forms of resistance, work slowdowns, you know, making fun of their oppressors through music, using that music as a form of resistance. So this one is called Pompey Ran Away. It's from Virginia. It was written down in Virginia in the late 1700s. And the kind of subtitle to it was A Negro Jig. And the music is written for fiddle, violin, or fife, or German flute, but this is it adapted for banjo.
It is great to hear that very, very different, so much mellower, and yet it does still have some of the, it has so much energy, right?
Yeah, it's like, it's so interesting because people definitely hear it and think, oh, that sounds like banjo-y, banjo-like, but then, you know, also kind of immediately notice that it doesn't, you know, doesn't sound quite like banjos that we're used to hearing today. Yeah.
I would love to ask you to talk even a little more, Kristina, about how you connect, you sort of radiate out in order to learn more about this instrument that so many people love and so many people can hear in their head and have a lot of ideas about. You drew a bigger circle, right? You started looking at a bigger area, right, of the Americas. You also started looking at practices of enslaved people and Black people, some not enslaved, in those spaces. And so the banjo becomes a feature in these, which of course it always was. It was never all about the banjo. And we kind of think of it as this singularly iconic thing, but it becomes more folded in. And I guess I'd like you to talk about some of the other things that are around it. And maybe you could take one example of like one of your favorite, people or, sites that led you in there, but where the spiritual aspects, you really can feel those a little bit. And because I think the secularization of the banjo, which we're going to get to as well. I want to see the tension or the evolution that you think, you've been able to see something earlier that is much deeper.
Yeah, so the one thing that I noticed was a lot of research basically is done in silos where, banjo folks had been looking just at the very narrow description in a historical account of like, what did the banjo look like? What did it, what are the descriptions there? And would kind of not necessarily ignore, but really foreground the banjo and then put other things in the background. And that's everything from, who this person was. Were they a musician? They're most often white, but, what is their place in the kind of social hierarchy? And I really felt like it really did come from this diorama from Suriname of exploring that and realizing, okay, there's no banjo here, but the banjo used to be central to this dance, which is why they share a name. And so knowing that you could look at, this art or this account without, of course, looking at the banjo and understanding, what it looked like or how it existed then, but then also looking at, what were the conditions as to why this dance was happening, when it was happening, who was dancing it, what were the, what was that religious part of it? How did white people not only observe it, but kind of interact with it? Was it something that was, condoned, supported, and understood, like, we don't really want enslaved people doing this because it could be an opportunity for revolt, which did happen. But understanding that, we have to give people an opportunity to express themselves for also fear of insurrection. But one of my favorite ones that was kind of, I talk a lot about the religious aspect of the banjo and how important it was to these religious, a lot of danced and sung religions, which is sometimes hard for people who are only familiar kind of with Western European Christianity to imagine that dancing, singing, drumming can invoke spirits, can get you in a bodily place where you can communicate with spirits. And that was what I was learning about the Banya Pre, was kind of some of the central functions of that. And I knew about this banjo that's in Berlin now, but it was collected in Suriname, which is where the dioramas are from. And I, had just like the briefest collection note that Brother Janza collected it in Suriname. And that was basically, so we had the physical object and this note about him. And once I started looking into, and I'll add that was an instrument that was only, rediscovered in 2014 in that collection in Berlin. It had been unknown until that point. and mislabeled as being misplaced in the collections as an Asian instrument. But once I started looking into Brother Yanza, I found that, first I learned that, okay, Brother, he's a missionary. He's a Moravian missionary. So he's German, comes to Suriname to convert enslaved people to Christianity, believing, that will help them, but also being kind of frustrated with slavery, knowing that impedes people's ability to be good members of the Moravian Church. Because if you don't have autonomy over yourself, you can't necessarily go to church. You cannot get married without, the permission of a slave owner. So you can't be in matrimony within the church without, this permission. So they understand that this is a system that they have to work in, but he is frustrated by it. But the Moravians were very detailed about sending reports from their missions back to the head church. And so I found all of these mission reports, including ones where Brother Yanza talks about why he was collecting items of the enslaved. And although he never specifically mentions collecting that instrument, he talks about other objects that he collected that are in that same collection in Berlin. And those had such clear religious value. And and when I say religious value, is they were part of the Winti religion that's similar to Vodou or Santeria. And the banjo was part of the songs that were played in the Winti religion for the Banya Pray. And so were these other objects. And he collected them specifically because he understood that if you practice Winti and you believe that there are, spirits residing in these jugs, for example, then you can't also be a Christian. And so for me to help you convert to Christianity, I'm going to take those things away from you. And that was
and so he was intervening not just as a collector, but as someone with his ideology, right? His spirit, his religious views that that had a harmful effect, right? And I think it's worth highlighting that through, you mentioned this, but the actions of so many white folks in various kinds of positions, not only plantation owners, right, were having this shaping and suppressing and divorcing, right, process that's not clear, it's not simple, we don't know all the contours, but that in the end had the effect of separating, right, the banjo from those kinds of ritualistic or spiritual uses. So I guess that kind of brings us to the other life of the banjo, which is a little more familiar, I think, to most folks, and probably certainly was to me, because the first part of the book was a lot of learning. And that is the period when it becomes the sort of American instrument, let's just say, in the 19th century, the early 19th century. And then eventually it becomes this sort of Americana, I guess, folk instrument. And so I would love to, and this is where our two books converge a lot. And so I've just written this book about the Stephen Foster song from 1853 of My Old Kentucky Home. And I wrote it because I grew up in Kentucky hearing this song and experiencing it as a treasured state anthem, as this thing that kicks off the Kentucky Derby, the most famous horse race in the world, and also the inspiration for a completely manufactured tourist attraction in the town of Bardstown, which is also known for bourbon, called the Old Kentucky Home State Park. So I wrote this book out of learning that this song was not what I imagined, this just nice longing song about home, but it was about a slave being sold away from Kentucky downriver to never see the people he loved again and to die in the sugarcane fields. And when I learned that, I was a little alarmed. So similarly, I was seeing a thing that had certain kinds of connotations that have morphed. But the banjo was so important to Stephen Foster, so important to everyone knows Oh Susanna, right? And so important to what I call America's first cultural worldwide creation that changed our status in the world. So this new country really hadn't done anything that the world recognized as culturally exciting until this thing called blackface minstrelsy came along. And the banjo is, as you call it, the obligatory instrument in the lineup of musicians and musicianship and performance that is the core of the blackface minstrel show, which had also dancing, also skits, all of which, however, were performed by white people pretending to be Black people for the entertainment of white people. And the banjo was a very important signifier of Blackness by this point. So I guess I would love to have us both riff a little on, how you came across this stage of banjo's history and its evolution, what you, found out, what you think is important, why people who already care about the banjo and care about American music should care about understanding this stage.
Yeah. You're so right that this was the first kind of like worldwide. Not only was it, America's first pop music craze, right. It was a worldwide phenomenon. And the thing that I always like to, along those lines, tell people is, it's like kind of like the birth of rock and roll, where all of a sudden you have this, American thing and it's all over the place. And to that end, the banjo is like what the banjo becomes during this period is like the electric guitar, where, and I'm going to just screen share for a second to kind of show us the difference between the, banjo, that's the one I was playing on the screen there. And then the one in the middle is a manufactured banjo by William Boucher, who had a shop in Baltimore. He was a German immigrant, and Baltimore was a huge blackface minstrel scene. There were tons of theaters, tons of people selling sheet music. They would have been selling Stephen Foster sheet music. Yeah. And Boucher saw this craze and wanted to make banjos in basically kind of an easily manufacturable way to get it into the hands of people. Gourd banjos, even though you think like, oh, it's a gourd, it's, somehow perhaps easier to make. The problem is every gourd is different. Every time you fit that neck to the gourd, you have to do it individually. There's no assembly line. There's no kind of quick process way to do it. Whereas with a wooden rim banjo, you got that circle, you got that neck, you put them together. You put that drum hardware on there to make it both louder, but also to kind of help with some environmental things. If you're playing on a soggy night, get a little tighter. And so this makes it so that basically anybody can buy a banjo. And the blackface minstrel craze is so big that people go and they buy not only from William Boucher, who's kind of the biggest manufacturer, but from lots of other people. And people start making their own banjos out of homemade materials. And the two images here, I think, also kind of talk about this period where the banjo is still very much thought of as a Black instrument, which is why they use it on the minstrel stage to be like, think, oh, I'm an authentic Black person, right. So I'm playing the banjo,
just like on the plantation.
Exactly. But then at the same time, you have, a Union soldier, not in blackface at all, playing a Boucher banjo. So in both of these images, the Eastman Johnson painting and the Civil War photograph, they're both Boucher banjos. So this was really this beginning period where you had, professional songwriters, professional musicians using the banjo as a symbol of not only Blackness, but this like really American art form. And so we, I talk about this painting in my book, Negro Life at the South, Eastman Johnson, which that earlier image is a study for this one, because this is kind of a period where the banjo is transforming, where it's not religious, where it's being played in secular settings, where you might have, a Black musician busking for money, and then you have a white musician appropriating that song and maybe, rewriting it a little bit and selling it off as their own. And then the thing that I talk about in the book, not only is the banjo, but that kind of how that imagery gets distorted and propagandized. So even though Eastman Johnson titled it Negro Life at the South, and this is set in Washington, D.C., and it was supposed to be kind of a political statement of, yes, slavery is still legal in 1859 in Washington, D.C., and this is a kind of decrepit institution that we shouldn't, be supporting. Other people saw this as, oh no, this is the imagery of, the happy carefree slaves, and surely we can keep them enslaved because they are happy. And that image, like, not only does this gain that name, the Old Kentucky Home, it's bought, and the first time it was bought and then later bought again, from the first owner, by folks who supported slavery and had made their money on the backs of enslaved African Americans through both sugar and cotton. And so, they've totally distorted Eastman Johnson's meaning of it. But that is what also then happens to the banjo, as and the banjo and minstrel music in general, as you point out in your book. And you shared an image that I'm going to flip to in a second, but just, kind of as we see here with Eastman Johnson, he's inspired by Dutch genre painters and, wanted to paint these people realistically, wanted to show humanity, but other people take this kind of same idea and scene and use it with very offensive stereotypes. And that's what Blackface minstrelsy were these really offensive stereotypes.
And those just continue to carry over for so long in our culture. The stereotypes that Blackface minstrelsy introduced into America and the world have been, have remained on the books, so to speak, like, of just happy-go-lucky, naturally musical people who don't have a care in the world really, and can live this simple life and be taken care of and be just fine. And that is a scene from a lantern slide show of the song My Old Kentucky Home. And it shows this, set in a enslaved person's cabin in Kentucky, before the point in the song comes when this the man in the family is somebody needs the owner needs some money, and he gets traded down south, and never to see that family again. And the same offensive kind of representation. This is the cover of my book, but the background is a play, the playbill for a play called The Stephen Foster Story that was put on every summer, an outdoor musical in Bardstown, Kentucky, for tourists. And in the top left corner, we had to crop, because that is a Blackface minstrel, and this is from the 1950s. Okay, so 100 years after the song, 100 years after Eastman Johnson, America is still seeing that as nostalgic Americana, and Blackface minstrels were in that play. I mean, they did it. Stephen Foster himself blacked up And it was it's been a very money-making part of the evocation of the Old South, right? This banjo. But then, the banjo moves forward in the hands of white players, not just blackface minstrel players. Some Black folks, do play it and play the same kind of songs after the Civil War when they first get a chance to get on stage, and the only thing they're really allowed to play are these same kind of Jim Crow kind of songs, right? Which unfortunately perpetuates some of the stereotypes even more because it's real Black people performing them. But then into the hands of another stage of America's music business, and one that leads up to our present, right? The country and hillbilly and folk music traditions.
And I think we're going to start questions here in a second, but the other thing that I, appreciate about your book so much, Emily, is I have people asking me kind of, wanting to know if we can know how authentic the music of Blackface minstrelsy is, because even though we think of it, I think if people know of it, they think of it as being, oh, wow, that's very offensive, but they don't realize how much it permeates our culture. They don't realize that it is, Oh, Susanna, the song that is played on ice cream trucks, that it is everywhere. And so they want to kind of parse out, like, well, could some of this actually be, come from African-American culture? And, one of the things that I say is, well, the Blackface minstrels wanted to be authentic. So they wanted to say that that's where they got it from. Because, that clip the song that I played, it's one of very few examples of transcriptions of African-American music from before minstrelsy. So we don't actually know a huge amount of what the music would have sounded like. But what you so definitely do in your book is explain that post-minstrelsy period where professional Black musicians were forced or felt the need to play these songs because they were popular. And so then that reinforced an idea that is, clearly even being perpetuated today, that these songs were authentic, even if it's being written by Stephen Foster, professional songwriter, that it's just become so, quote unquote, that it's traditional. And if it's traditional, well, it must be authentic somehow, and if it's authentic, it's okay, and all of these things are not necessarily true. But until we kind of start examining what that is, and my final thing that I'll say is, I hadn't wanted to write about Blackface minstrelsy because it's so tricky and it's so hard, and there's so much mythology, but it's also difficult imagery to look at. It's difficult to read about, but yet we have to kind of examine that if we want to talk about the music that comes before and after.
It is the origin of American popular music, and it's been in some ways romanticized in those origins. I think there's a lot of new scholarship that's asking harder questions about that. And W.C. Handy said, maybe Stephen Foster was sympathetic to us, who knows, but if you really want Black music, there's some that offends nobody, and it's called spirituals. Right. So we have questions. Yay. Thank you, Kristina.
Thank you, Emily.
All right. Thank you both. Thank you, Kristina and Emily. I know that, we want to be respectful of people's time. So, an hour is our goal, but this is one of those conversations where I, certainly I would be fine with y'all just continuing for a while, but we won't do that. We'll respect everybody's time. We'll get to some questions. So thank you so much. The first one is from Leslie McLean, who asks, what resources do you suggest for banjoists who embrace old-time music to understand the history and potential problematic history of various tunes? Leslie says, I'm new to this genre and am worried about playing tunes that bring tension rather than pleasure. It's a really good question.
It's a great question. One, if somebody's willing to do a little bit of research, one archive that both Emily and I utilized a lot is called the Lester Levy Collection. at Johns Hopkins University, and it's a premier sheet music collection. And so if there's a song that you play in your old time, traditional music repertoire, and you basically want to know whether it is a minstrel tune or not, you can type it into the search bar and sheet music will pop up. If it is a blackface minstrel tune, you will get those results, and you can see the year. You will probably see an offensive cover, a sheet music cover that is offensive depictions of African Americans on it. But it's just a great kind of primary source to go and see, where a song might have originated. And that's not to say that if it doesn't show up there, it's not a blackface minstrel tune, but that's a good kind of starting place. I would also recommend that folks check out Decolonize the Music Room, which is a nonprofit that works to do exactly that, which is decolonize music and not just about blackface minstrelsy, but other kind of songs that have entered the traditional American music canon that have, problems that are problematic. And then the Rhapsody Project out of Seattle also has some online learning things about how to kind of center African-American music across genres and learn more about the origins of tunes. So those are some resources for folks to use.
That's great. Thank you for having that at the ready, Kristina. Emily, did you have anything to add?
No, those are really good. And I mean, one of the things that it does bring up, though, is so many of those blackface minstrel tunes were put through educational, institutions. So children were taught Turkey in the Straw and, My Old Kentucky Home and Oh, Susanna, and so many others, Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. And that was part of the system. And that's why they're so deeply in people. They feel traditional because they started being taught that way in the late 19th century and through the, much of the 20th century.
And I do want to quote Stephanie, because she and I chatted today at Malaprops, and to the point of just because it's traditional doesn't mean that it's okay, doesn't mean that it's good. So even if it has some deep roots that don't come from minstrelsy, and is some part of some other tradition, that doesn't necessarily make it it doesn't make it something that you can play without kind of having a critical look at it.
Yeah, we did talk earlier, and that, which was great. I'm glad we got to do that. And it just comes up a lot where we use the term traditional to try and signal that something is okay or right or good, or and that's not always the case. Sometimes traditional things are not cool.
Yes.
Yeah. So next question from Whitney, who says, what was the hardest aspect of writing about the banjo as an integral part of abolition/resistance when white supremacy has tried to obscure so much of African spirituality?
I think the hardest thing is having to a lot of it filter basically out from the white observer. And so one of the things that I tried, I have a footnote in the book about, not wanting to re-traumatize readers. And so while I do, there's nothing made up, there's no, falsifications of history, and I want to be real about, the time period we're writing about. At the same time, I didn't want to kind of, re-traumatize or titillate people. And so to kind of take, honestly, some things that even for me as a white woman living today are hard to read, and put them in language that is, wouldn't harm people as they're reading it. And that was something that was kind of constantly in my mind and working through. And oftentimes that meant, reading the writings of white men who were very derogatory, very racist, just sometimes, cruel people who were absolutely disgusting, you just don't want to even kind of talk about what they did, because it is so awful. And to take that, but then to also try to kind of peel it back, and what can we learn from things underneath that. So that's, and then, just the difficulty of not having a lot of sources, of having, those sources that are, white folks writing about it with their very clear biases, and then having, also some, oral histories or things that have been passed down, and trying to figure out it, is that, even if there's no historical record of it, what can we learn from that? As historians, it's always like, can you footnote it? Can you provide the source for that? Is that a reliable source? And sometimes I think you have to accept that if you want the history of marginalized people, there might not be the kind of source that you want, and you have to work with what you have.
Emily, I suspect you encountered some similar difficulties doing research. So I'll pose the appropriate version of that question to you as well when you're researching.
I mean, my story originates in blackface minstrelsy. That's the form that Stephen Foster was, encountered as a child, and realized as he started writing music that it was the only form that could pay him. He was someone who, had the crazy idea that you could make a living being a composer of popular music. He was kind of the first person to give that a whirl. And he tried other kinds of songs. He wrote like hundreds of songs, and most of them are not actually blackface minstrel songs, but they didn't make any money, almost any of them. Jeannie with the light brown hair being one exception. So anyway, I had to immerse myself in that world that was what he was, responding to and reshaping in some ways too. And my, ironically, many of his songs are very sentimental, My Old Kentucky Home being one. And I argue that the sentimentality, the layer of sentimentality that he placed on these very ugly, very dismissive of the pain of slavery stories, that layer of sentimentality enabled sympathetic white people to still swallow some of these depictions of Blackness that were so destructive. So that just felt, it was a long period in archives, and not a pleasant part of it. But I do think this country has just not wanted to face what blackface minstrelsy was, and so that it was necessary. But yeah.
I forgive me. I'll just want to interject that I know someone who confided that he himself, and he's, older than I am, but, a vital person, right? That he in his youth was in a singing group that performed blackface minstrelsy, right? So it's not like it's even just this sort of historical artifact of a bygone era either. There are folks walking around today who, grew up, as you said, learning songs at school, perhaps even performing, the same way, not on regular tours or whatever anymore, but like getting together at, local community halls and doing this sort of thing in decades that are not very far removed.
And it was seen as harmless by them, truly. And I'm glad you mentioned that. I've had many people approach me and sort of confess that as well.
Yeah. He shared a photo. It was
part of who we have been as a country, but thank goodness they're looking at it now.
Yeah. Well, he's now someone who devotes a lot of time to anti-racist work, in part for that reason, right? Like once once the scales have been removed, as it were, or that sort of thing, that but yes, it's something that's still appreciative of your work to kind of expose, again, as you say, that is the root of is the forebear of popular music, in a way that I think people really just don't understand, and don't understand how harmful it was in its cultural impact.
And I think both Kristina and I also are coming from a place of having taken I cried to my old Kentucky home, not knowing what the hell I was crying about, that there was something way bigger to cry about than whatever, oh, I'm back in Kentucky, or there are those beautiful horses again, or whatever.
Yeah.
That song evoked for me. And same for you, Kristina. I think this is one of the difficulties and wonders of the work is, having the chance to revisit our own assumptions and our own, treasured kind of ideas or sympathies, right? And give them the critical, treatment that we are fortunate enough to take the time and have the time to give them. So, how you felt about the banjo and how important it is to you in your life, right? But you didn't know these things.
Yeah. And that's also I hope with your book, Emily, and with my book, that people take that as kind of the opportunity to at least, start reflecting on some of these things.
It's all around us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the question from Whitney, who says, is there any evidence for the banjos? I should say it's 7:01. I just realized, I'm sorry. So let me just ask, because we do have a few more questions. I said that we get to as many as we could, but we are actually at the top of the hour. I will ask another one if you two have time, and I'll apologize to any of the other ones we don't get to. It's been a great discussion. So would you like to take one more question, or would you like to wrap up?
Let's do one.
Okay. Okay. Whitney asks, is there any evidence for the banjo's quote unquote reclamation by whites in popular and minstrel music as an avenue for slave owners, etc., to deter possible rebellion, i.e. remove the instrument's power? So in addition to just picking it up and saying, this is a cool instrument and we can make this, discovering that they can make this music and, pretend to channel this stereotypical notion of Blackness, was there something more sort of politic at play at any point in any of that? And it might post-date enslavement enough that it might not be that, because you'll have to correct me on the timelines, but of course the oppression of Black folks didn't stop with enslavement. So, there was plenty of, anti-Black terrorism and political activity after that point. So was it ever part of that, right?
I don't have any particular examples that jump to mind where you definitely have the enslavers destroying banjos because of their power, basically, and their ability to bring people together to be part of this ritual, that there's multiple instances of, but I can't off the top of my head think of any where an enslaver would have kind of said, oh, you can play it, but not in that religious spiritual context, that it was, I feel what we really see before minstrelsy is it being, there were many Black musicians who did not play the banjo, or who play the banjo and the fiddle, or the banjo and the fife, or other musical instruments, and that was part of their expected labor, was enslaved people as musicians. But and there are a couple of examples where white folks, not necessarily with the banjo, but with dances of stop doing that dance, which is a ritual dance related to, Vodou or Winti or, African diasporic religions, and instead dance this European set dance. But of course, what happens there is, the resiliency of people is that set dance just gets incorporated into the culture and the religion to basically say, we're going to mask what we're doing under the guise of what you would like us to do. And we're actually going to just keep doing our same thing, but you're not going to be able to tell the difference because you don't understand our culture. And so even in the Caribbean today, there are traditions where you see dancing and it looks like, American square dancing basically, but it's from these kind of melding of African, Afro-Caribbean and European traditions into a new dance. So, my feeling is really like almost anytime any white oppressors try to say, you can't do this, or we're going to try to get one over on you to play this other instrument or dance this other dance, people found a way to do what they needed to do for religious and spiritual and community reasons. But as you point out, Stephanie, afterwards, I think that a lot of that imagery, and especially a lot of what Emily talks about in her book, is that imagery is the image of, the happy slave with the banjo is used as a tool of oppression to deny humanity for African Americans through the instrument. But maybe you want to say more, Emily.
Yeah, I just would say, I would turn that upside down and say it's almost by forcing the banjo into the hands of Black performers who were on stages in the post-war period, that it almost that was its own kind of violence, right? On the other hand, some of those performers maybe, they found ways to be resistant, within their performances as well. But it is almost like I would say the flip side of the question of not so much taking away, but imposing certain kind of banjo use and music.
Right. So when it came to appropriating the power of the instrument, it was just as much or maybe more so putting it back in the hands of people, but telling them how to use it as it was, taking it from them and appropriating it, to begin with.
And I think that brings to the, to the reclamation that, is happening today. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd love to just end with that kind of idea, is that so I've got those the pieces that are about kind of the first person. I can talk about that also but another day. But most of it's the historical. But at the end, I wanted to talk about, Black banjo players today and, what it means to play the instrument, what it means to have found, this history. And Jake Blunt, who is a fantastic banjo player and fiddler, has an amazing new album called The New Faith, which I suggest everybody go listen to. He talks about this even today, he told me the fact that this music was played by Black people back in the day almost gets used as a get out of jail free card for there not being any Black people around now playing old time music, bluegrass, the banjo. I don't even know if that's a conscious thought. I think there's fetishism for the Black history of the music and also an exoticism. And then he goes on to say that, that this type of music needs to be open to the sound shifting. That's just part of the deal. Black people don't have the same musical references as white people, and regulating the sound isn't asking Black people to come back to the music. It's asking Black people to come back into the music specifically in the way that white people want us to. And so, that same idea of you can play this music, but only if you do it the way that we expect you to do it, and how that can still be harmful to people.
Similar thing happens in country, right?
Yes.
People can't be legitimate, country stars. And that is a great place to end, and also a sort of a hopeful place to end in terms of Black folks, reclaiming the instrument. I read a really interesting article not so long ago about a similar thing with tap dance.
Yes.
again, discussion for another day. Sorry for the tangent, y'all. So we will we will wrap this up. Thank you both so much, Kristina and Emily, for being with us this evening and for your work. Again, I just want to encourage everyone here, if you haven't picked up these books, to please do so as soon as you can, and to support your local independent bookstores. You can tell from this conversation that there's a lot more there to read that you'll appreciate reading. And we look forward to seeing y'all whenever, however, wherever we can. And please stay safe and well in the meantime. And thank you all so much again.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Emily. So
That was
grateful.
great. Thank you.